And welcome everybody to this presentation on getting ready for personalization with DMS. Let's take you through a quick introduction. So what you can expect from this webinar. So in this webinar we're going to show you how you can assess your current Sitecore solution to determine if you're ready to implement DMS personalization. We'll go through to understand what personalization is. We'll go through how personalization works in Sitecore using the Digital Marketing Suite, DMS. We'll assess some existing solution components, so I have a demo to show you how this can be done. We'll identify some common issues with those components and go through a common issues list. And then for the developers in the audience, I'll show you how to fix those issues and some best practices when you're doing Sitecore component development to make sure that your components are ready for DMS personalization in Sitecore. So a bit of background on myself. I'm Alistair Denise. I am the CMS Practice Head here at eDynamic. I've been a Sitecore MVP since 2008. I typically work on Sitecore projects as an architect. I've been an architect on a variety of different projects for different industries such as travel, legal and financial. I'm quite an active blogger. I'm regularly writing blog posts on my personal blog and the eDynamic blog. And we've got links down there for those. I'm also a contributor to the first official Sitecore book that was published, written by John West. So John West didn't write the whole book himself. He got a lot of help from the MVP community. So I'm quite proud to say that I was part of that as well. Okay, so let's first of all discuss the scenario that we're investigating here. So we've got our brand new Sitecore site. So we've gone through the build, test, deploy phase. We've got our site. We've filled it full of content and the site is now running. Okay, we're servicing traffic and everything's great. Once we finally get over the initial hassle of getting the site live and getting all the content in and getting down to that steady state of just maintaining the site, and we ask ourselves, okay, what's the next thing? How can we implement and utilize personalization with DMS? At Sitecore Symposium last year, there was a data point given. I can't remember the exact number, but someone was mentioning that a very large proportion of the licenses for Sitecore that are sold are done so purely off the back of DMS. DMS demos really well. A lot of marketers really understand the value of personalization and analytics, and they want to make use of that. But I find that many people don't know how to get into personalization. They don't know what the next step is. Content they can understand, they can author their content, they can get it all in, they can get the website running, they can keep it running. But the thing that they lack is how do we make that next step? How do we utilize DMS and start doing personalization? So what we're talking about in this webinar is how we can identify if we're ready to start personalization, to identify to make sure that the solution that we're using has been written in such a way to allow for personalization to work. So let's start with understanding what personalization is. So we can summarize personalization quite simply into targeting a relevant message to an appropriate user. So in a typical traditional scenario, without personalization, we're treating all of our users the same. We're broadcasting the same message to everybody no matter who you are. Okay, it's a broadcast. Everybody is the same. With personalization, we're targeting a particular message to different users of the website. The message is personalized, hence the term personalization. Okay, so we understand who the person is, and then we can present things a little bit different to you to try to engage you more. So website users today, they're not just looking for information, they're looking for relevant information, things that are relevant to them. Take, for example, one of the most classic personalization examples would be Amazon's suggested selling widget, if you'd like to call it that. So when you go to a product page inside Amazon, when you're looking at a product, there is a panel down the bottom that says, other things that you may be interested in, or another one is other things that people that looked at this product also bought. Okay, this is a kind of personalization, because rather than just having a generic, here are some specials that we're selling, they're actually taking some information about you. The information they're taking about you is the product that you're currently looking at. Okay, they know a little bit about you. For example, if this was a book on IT that you were looking at, we know that you read, and we know that you're probably into IT, because hence you're looking at the IT books. So based on that small amount of information, Amazon can make suggestions for other things that you might be interested in. So this is how they're targeting a message to you specifically, rather than just broadcasting a generic message. To give you a bit of an example on that, let's take this very basic website prototype, wireframe. Okay, it's a basic page, and we've got some ancillary components on the side, some related links, and an advertisement. Now, let's say, so as you can see here in this first example, these are very generic. We've got a generic ad up there, and we've got a set of generic links. Now, as you navigate around on the site, somehow we determined that when it comes to refreshments, you prefer to drink beer. Okay? If we know that, we can tailor those pieces of information on the side of the page to be more specific to you. So the whole idea is we want you to be able to find information that's relevant to you. So we can change those set of links to a set of links that's relevant to beer. We can change that ad to an ad promoting some kind of beer product, perhaps. Likewise, we may determine that you don't actually like beer, you like wine instead. So let's change our message to be more relevant to the wine drinkers. So having a look at how DMS would do this, we start with our generic baseline sample page, and for the beer drinker, we need to change that page. We're going to take those related links, and we're going to change the data. Okay, I'll explain how that's done in a little bit, but what we want to do is we want to change the data. The component, the widget itself, stays the same. What we want to change is the data that's being fed to it. Likewise with the ad, we want to change the data that is being fed to the ads. So instead of displaying the generic ad, we're displaying an ad for beer. Okay, and for our wine drinker, we want to add a completely new component to the page. So this sign-up form, we have plenty of beer drinkers that are signed up for the newsletter, but wine drinkers, for example, we want more wine drinkers. So we can add a brand new component if you are a wine drinker. So this is one point of DMS. It's not just about changing components, the existing components that are on the page. You can add brand new components as well. And likewise, we want to change that set of links to wine relevant links. We want to change that ad as well to a particular wine ad. Okay, so that was just a little bit of an explanation about how you can personalize through DMS. So let's have a look at how it works. So given our sample page, let's have a look at how, when you're thinking about personalization, it's not generally the entire page that you want to personalize. In fact, the content of the page is likely to stay the same. It's generally going to be that ancillary data, okay, those widgets that you want to change. So it's a good idea to think about, when you're thinking about personalization, to think in terms of widgets, or think in terms of page components in the case of Sitecore. So what we're looking at here is a presentation definition for a particular item inside Sitecore. So you can see there we have a variety of components. Let's just have a look at how those relate to the components that we can see on the page. So we have there the article component, and that's responsible for outputting the major content of the page. Then we've got the related links component there, which is using some generic links data source. We've got our ad down the bottom as well. With DMS, we use the Sitecore rules engine to orchestrate components. So it's the rules engine that is responsible for making a change to a component. So let's say that we're in the presentation definition dialog there. I've selected the related links component. Now I can press the personalize button and open up the personalization or the rules dialog. You can see here we have a number of rules in here to handle different cases, different sets of conditions that we need to change the component. So for the default set down the bottom, we're simply going to use a particular set of data. For a user 1 persona, so you can see there in the condition text, profile. So what we're saying here is we're going to use some profiling data based on your previous browsing history on the website to determine that you like or you prefer beer as a refreshment. And we're going to change the data source there. We're going to change that from the normal links to the user 1 links. We could use another condition. So rather than targeting a specific profile, we may want to target users from a particular country. So we could say, if you're from the US, we want to change the data again, because we find that people from the US, for example, this particular content is more relevant for them. This is just a bit of an example. So we can change the component in a number of different ways. We can hide the component. We can completely change the component. For example, we may say, well, rather than showing the related links, we would like to show another ad, for example. And we can also change the component data, which is what we were talking about previously. So changing the data, we're going to give a different set of data to the component to display, such as the beer links or the wine links. Then after we're done with that dialog, we can hit the OK button. And we can now see there's a little 3 on that related links component. Okay, so this is just telling me in this presentation dialog that this particular component has now been personalized. Now what I'm showing you here is the presentation definition dialog, but all of this is also possible in the page editor, and I'll show you in the demo a little bit later using the page editor. So using the page editor, you generally don't see the presentation definition dialog. It's a little bit simpler, but you still see the rules dialog. So just to touch on conditions, so the Sitecore rules engine allows for a number of different conditions based on different criteria. So we can create a condition that takes into account the particular DMS profile. So I'll just quickly explain about the profile. The way a profile works in DMS, we profile pages of the site. And when we profile them, we say that for a particular profile key, which we define, we can give the page a particular value. So let's say we've got some different profile keys. We may have job role, such as you're a developer, you're a project manager, you're an accountant, for example. Throughout my site, I can now rate my content, and I can give each piece of content a particular value to say how likely a developer or a project manager or an accountant is to look at that piece of content. Some articles on my site, some pages, are definitely going to be more developer-oriented than they are accountant-oriented. And so I can use that information to work out what kind of profile I can apply to each. As a website user navigates around the pages on my site, Sitecore takes the profiles assigned to each of those pages and builds up an aggregate for the current user. And then we can match the shape of that data to a predetermined card. So in the previous case where I showed we're matching in the refreshment profile, we're matching against the beer preference card. So what we're saying there is when the user is navigating around my site, I'm going to have pages relating to beer, and I'm going to have pages relating to wine. And as the user navigates around, we start to build up this profile. I've got another predetermined shape of data to say whether a user looks like they prefer beer to wine, and then I can make decisions and make conditions based on that particular profile. Some other conditions that can be used, the referrer, so the previous site that you entered from. For example, if you entered the site from a competitor's website, I would like to display a 10% discount ad in the sidebar. Okay, that's a common case there. We could also do the manual classification of the user by some of the marketing staff. A previously triggered goal. So just to explain what a goal is. A goal is when a user on the site has performed a particular desired operation, if you like. For example, they've reached the thank you page after filling in a form. They've downloaded a certain file. Okay, we can assign goals to those in DMS. So we can say, okay, if you have already downloaded the white paper, so you've triggered the download white paper goal, now we're going to personalize based on that. For example, if we were displaying links in the sidebar to download the white paper, it's somewhat redundant now to continue to display that component if the user has already downloaded the white paper. So we can remove the component, or we may change the component to use a different data source and say, okay, you've already downloaded the white paper, why don't you download the price list now? We could also create a condition based on the location of the user, such as city, country, etc. We could create a condition based on the engagement plan state. So engagement plans are another aspect of DMS. Now, I know that there's an official explanation out there about what they are, but I still can't find a better explanation for what an engagement plan is other than it's a workflow for people. So with an engagement plan in DMS, I can create a set of states, a workflow essentially, connected by different vertices, and I can place users into a particular state of that engagement plan, and then they filter through that. So it's a little bit abstract and generic. A good use of an engagement plan would be, we want to try to get people to come back to the website. We're going to send out an email to try to entice people to come back. When I send out that email, I'm starting off an engagement plan. And in that engagement plan, I can determine how I want people to go. So the first state of the engagement plan is the users have received the email. The next step may be the users have come to the website. The next one may be the users have stayed on the website for 3 minutes and they've viewed at least 7 pages. Okay? Based on any of these states, I can personalize you through DMS. So when the user has been on the site for more than 3 minutes and they've viewed more than 7 pages, now I can write a condition on that. So I could say, here's another promotion. Or probably for the bigger point, with an engagement plan, I may have another state which is the user has left the website. And if you've left the website, I'm going to wait a week, and then I'm going to send you another follow-up email to try to entice you back to the website. And probably in that state, that's when I'll start to personalize on the website. Okay, I finally got you back for the second time. I'm going to offer you a discount now if you take up a particular offer. The rules engine in Sitecore is also very flexible, so we can write our own custom conditions for the rules engine. The Sitecore comes, as you can see here, with a large number of pre-built conditions, but if something isn't here that you're after, that can be developed as well. You can create your own custom conditions. And there's also many more that I've listed here. So I've mentioned changing a component's data quite often. Okay, so when we say that in DMS, we're talking about changing the data source that is fed to the component. So I've got a very small sample content tree here for a Sitecore site. This section up here are the pages of my website. Okay, so these are the things that people navigate around, and this is where they read the content. Down below that, I have the component data. Okay, these are my data sources that I'm using for various widgets and components on my website. So let's say a request comes in and we're looking at this particular item, and here's the presentation of the components that are used to display that item. For one of those items, such as the related links component, I manually configure and say I want you to use this piece of data. Okay, so rather than the context data, rather than the data that was requested, which is the page, which is being handled by a different component, this particular component, I want to use this particular set of data. So when we're changing the data source, we're simply changing which piece of data is being fed to that particular component. So that's a bit of an introduction into what personalization is and how we can do personalization using DMS. So, okay, the next step would be to try to implement some personalization. So first of all, we need to assess whether the component that we want to personalize can be personalized. Okay, it needs to be developed in the right way so that the rules engine can orchestrate it. So, as I mentioned before, a couple of different things that we can do with a component in a given rule. We can hide it, we can change it, we can change the data source. There's no assessment required for hiding the component and changing the component. Regardless of how that component has been written, I don't need to check if I can hide it or if I can change it. Okay, I know that I can hide it regardless of how it's been implemented. Changing the component will probably require some configuration within my Sitecore solution, but again, it's not something that I have to go back to development to do. So when I'm assessing my component, I'm essentially just going to be assessing it to see if I can change the data source, see if I can change the data that's being fed to it. So the process for making this assessment, first of all, I need to identify an appropriate component to be personalized, such as an ad in the sidebar or a set of related links or something like that. I'm then going to check if the component uses a data source, because if it is currently using a data source, then it's very likely that I can change that data source and the component will change, and that's exactly what we're after. Regardless, I'm going to change that, try changing the data source to see if the component reacts. So even if there's no data source set, I'll set a data source. Quite often, a component could be written that even without a data source set, it's going to default to the requested item. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a visualization around how we change the data source and what this means, what it's actually doing. So let's say we have component 1 here, and I've got a particular data source that has been configured. When the component uses that data source, I expect some kind of output. Okay, so for data source 1, I get output 1. Now what I'm expecting, if I set a different data source with different data for the component, I'll expect that output to change. Okay, and if that output doesn't change, then that means that the component probably hasn't been written in the correct way. It's not paying attention to the data source. It's probably using some other kind of logic to find the content it needs to display, or it's using the context item. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick demo of assessing a component in an existing Sitecore solution. So I've got my demo Sitecore site here. Okay, I've got a particular item selected, so just referring back to one of the previous slides, the top section is my pages, and then underneath this references section, these are all my data sources. So this is the data sources for my widgets and components. Okay, I'm going to launch the page editor because this gives a bit of a nicer, friendlier view when you're doing personalization and when you're managing components on the website. Okay, so I'm going to click the Add New Component button, and then this placeholder pops up over here. So I'm going to add it to here. I'm going to add the component to the sidebar of this page. Okay, let's select the Add component. So after I select a component, it asks me what data should be used for the component. Now this pops up because for that particular component, I've configured the data source template and the data source location. So that's something developers need to configure to make sure that when you add a component, it works this way. If those two pieces of information haven't been set or configured for the component, this dialog would not pop up. It would simply put the component on the page and leave it. Okay, so in this dialog, I can select an existing data source. So I can say, okay, I want to display an existing ad, or I can create a new piece of content by clicking the Create New Content button. For our purposes, I'm just going to select an existing piece of content. So add one. Okay, and then the component gets added to the page. As we can see there, the title is Add Alpha. I've got this particular image and some text. Now I've got this button up here, Set Associated Content. Okay, this is the Change Data Source button. So if I click that, that same familiar dialog pops up, and it allows me to change my selection. So I can select a different piece of an existing piece of content, or again, I could create a new piece of content. For this demo, I'll just select a different piece of content, existing content. Okay. Now, as you can see, after I click the OK button, the title has changed. This is now Add Beta rather than Add Alpha. The image has changed as well as the text in the link. So, okay, that's exactly what we're after. So we've been able to assess that the add component is ready for personalization. I can use the rules engine to change that because I can change the data source and the component reacts. Okay, that's exactly what we're after. Now, I had another component that I wanted to try, so let's remove the existing component. And I'll click on the Add New Component button. And then once that placeholder pops up, I'll click on that to add the component to that particular placeholder. So I'm going to select the Related Links component. Okay, again, once I've selected that, it asks which data source I'd like to use. So in this case, let's create some new content. I'm going to say new links. Okay, this is a little odd. I've told it to use a new data source, but it's already giving me links and a title. So this should be the first warning that maybe this component isn't paying attention to its data source. Maybe this one can't be personalized just yet. In fact, if I click on this button here, which allows me to edit the fields of that data source, okay, again, I can see that I've got a title here, the title field. Okay, maybe the related links label there is a default value. So let's just try adding something. Okay, so I've got a title now. Now this should be another warning bell. I haven't selected any links, but it's displaying links on my component. Okay, again, maybe that's just a default value. So let's just select a couple of links here. So we'll select services and case studies. And we'll hit OK. Okay, it hasn't refreshed. Okay, we'll just save it to force a refresh. Again, it hasn't refreshed. Okay, so this component is not personalizable. Okay, it hasn't been written in the correct fashion. Just to absolutely make sure, let's try changing the data source. So I'll change it to the beer links. Okay, again, the component hasn't updated, which means that, yeah, it's pretty safe to say that this component has not been written in the right way. Okay, this component cannot be orchestrated through the rules engine. Having said that, I still could use conditions to hide the component under a certain set of conditions, or to change it to a different component. Okay, so that was just a quick demo into assessing a component to see if it's ready to be personalized. So let's go through a couple of common issues, a couple of roadblocks to personalization and having our components react to personalization. Number one, static placement of a component. So there are two ways in Sitecore to add a component to a page. It can either be added statically or it can be added dynamically. Through the presentation definition dialog that we were looking at before, and when I'm using the page editor, that's adding the component dynamically, because when I click the Add button, it instructs Sitecore to add that component and it stores that data separately. If the component was statically placed, then the developer would have hard-coded that component into my page. So a way to, or a method to determine if our component is statically placed or not, first of all, we identify the component we want to personalize. So let's say the generic add here in the sidebar again. If I open up the presentation definition for that particular item, okay, and in this dialog, the only thing I can see here is the content with sidebar component. Okay, and I know that this is the content with sidebar component because I've got the sidebar there. But I don't see any component in there relating to the generic add component. Okay, so it's probably that the links and the add have been hard-coded into that content with sidebar component. Okay, if the item has been hard-coded, if it has been statically placed, I can't personalize it. Okay, the personalization engine works with dynamically placed content. So if I'm using the page editor, then the component will be dynamically placed and I can personalize it. Now, keep in mind, static placement is required at times for non-personalized components. For example, the header, the footer, maybe the menu of the site. Those are all very good candidates for static placement. Okay, you wouldn't want to dynamically place absolutely everything on the page because this presentation dialog would just become huge. Okay, it's not uncommon to have 50 components on a page to build that page. So whenever the architect is designing the solution, there's always a balance between how much is statically placed in terms of components and how many components are dynamically bound. Okay, and you have to kind of have a bit of forethought in there around when I'm building up my presentation definition, what is a likely candidate for personalization? So as an architect, I could have a look at this original page and I could say, you know what, I think that those links and that add, they're good candidates for personalization, so I'll make sure that those are dynamically bound in the presentation definition rather than statically placing them inside the host component. Another common issue is having component fields embedded within the host page. Okay, so if you have a look at this particular example, okay, I've got the bad architecture page. We can see in there we've got our regular content fields. We've got, well, we can't see in this particular screenshot, but I've got the title, I've got the body of the content, but I've also got some other fields in here, the add title and the add image. Okay, so these are not part of a separate data source that's being fed to my component. These are within the page itself. Now, when a field is part of the page, what that's saying is that it's embedded within it. Okay, we can't extract it. So add title and add image and all the other associated add fields are part of the page itself. If I was to try to change the data source, well, look, I can, but it's very clunky because when I'm defining a different set of data, I can't just define the data for the add in isolation. I have to define a whole new page, okay, of which I may only be using the add fields, the add title, the add image, etc. Okay, so although it kind of works, it's very clunky and it's not particularly nice. Chances are, if you're looking at your solution and you've got fields related to the components that are embedded within the page, all of the extra things have not been configured for the component, okay, because the developers obviously haven't been thinking, or the architect hasn't designed the solution in such a way to be thinking about, you know, in terms of components, to be thinking about personalization and changing a data source, which means they wouldn't have done the configuration of the component. So when you add the component to the page editor, that you get that dialog popping up saying what's the data source that you want to use, create new content, use existing, okay, that kind of thing. This is a bad architectural design right here, okay. In extension to the DMS aspects of it, with a set of static fields, as the author, I can't determine if I want the ad to display first or the related links to display first, okay? Because the developers would have hard-coded into the solution how it's pulling that data out and how it's putting it on the page, okay? So to fix this particular issue, a developer needs to extract out those fields to a separate data source template, okay? So we need to actually create an ad data template, and then we use that. So as we've seen through the demo, we can use that. When I created the ad, those existing ad data sources were based on a specific on a data template specific for the ad, an ad data template. Okay, and in that ad data template, I had the title, the image, etc., etc. Probably the most common issue that I see when I pick up an existing solution that can't be personalized. Components are written, when the components are written, they use the context item rather than the data source that has been configured for them. So let's just explain what that means. So we have a user, and they make a request to the website. Sitecore takes that request and maps that onto an item in the content tree. Because let's say we've mapped onto this particular item right here. For my component, every component gets access to that context item. Sitecore makes it very easy to gain access to that particular item that was requested. And quite often this is where developers stop. They go, okay, that's the requested item. If they're using a data structure as was presented in the previous slide, the fields required for that component are embedded within the page. Then I can just use the context item to get the data and put it onto the page. But as we've described, that's a very inflexible solution. What we needed to do is to pay attention to the data source that's configured. Okay, so although through the API, which is something that developers use, I can gain access to the item that was requested, the context item, I need my component to instead check if a data source has been configured. So again, that's another piece of data that is presented to my component that I can use, and that's what I should be using it. And if the data source hasn't been configured, then I can fall back and use the context item. For the developers out there, XSLT renderings already use the data source if provided. So there are two major different kinds of component in Sitecore that we personalize. There are sub-layouts and there are renderings. A lot of developers, I find, prefer sub-layouts. They're written with standard .NET code, such as C#, and you have to use the appropriate APIs to make sure that you're reading the appropriate data. And XSLT rendering, XSLT is a very different technology to C# and to a standard .NET language. However, one of the benefits that XSLT has in Sitecore is that it already has been configured to pay attention to the data source if that's been provided and fall back to the context item if it hasn't been. So to make our sublayouts work, if they don't currently work, we need to write code to update them. Okay, so those are the common issues that we face when we're trying to embark on personalization with DMS. Okay, unfortunately, it's a very somber outcome. You know, if the component hasn't been written in the right way, then you cannot personalize it. It's as simple as that. No amount of tweaking, no amount of configuration through the Sitecore backend. There's no setting to make it just magically work. If it hasn't been developed, if it hasn't been written by the developer in the right way, then you cannot personalize it. Okay, it's as simple as that. So for the developers in the audience, here's a couple of tips that you can use to make sure that when you develop a component, you're developing it in the right way to make sure that you can personalize it with DMS. And if you're not a developer sitting there watching this, if you're a manager or if you're a marketer, you could pass these tips on to your developer to make sure that they're following these when they're developing the components to make sure that they can be personalized. So just to run through the tips. Design page data templates to extract common fields to separate data templates. So as we described in the previous slide, don't embed the component fields within the host page, okay? Make sure when you design your data infrastructure that you extract out those fields to a separate data source, to a separate data template, to allow data sources to be configured independently of the page itself. Probably the biggest tip, use the data source, not the context item. Okay, for developers it's very easy to use the context item. It's one line of code. But to use the data source requires a little bit more knowledge and slightly more code. XSLT renderings, as discussed previously, they already use the data source that's been provided. Another tip, and this isn't absolutely relevant to DMS, but it's a good tip and it does allow greater flexibility, is to utilize parameters to adjust component behavior rather than subclassing. So what this means is, and I see in many solutions, developer will create, let's say, a related links component. Related links 3 links, related links 4 links, related links 5 links. Okay, I just named 3 separate components there. They all do the same thing. They all work the same way. They all display the same way. The only difference is the number of links that each of them displays. And I've seen solutions that I picked up where this has been the case, where developers have created a component and then created it again and again just to change one tiny little aspect of it. Okay, we can pass in parameters from Sitecore to a component. Okay, and we can also do that using the rules engine. Okay, now the interfaces that I've used in this presentation, they only allow hiding the component, changing the component, and changing the component's data source. But if I get into the more advanced interfaces, the ones that developers use, I can also change things like parameters. I can't think why you would want to change the number of related links displayed based on personalization, but you could. Okay, that's a possibility. Kind of the whole point of Sitecore and DMS and that platform is it's quite open and generic. Okay, it's not being very prescriptive in exactly what you can do in terms of personalization. So you may find a case where, yes, I need to change the color. Okay, there's a good one. I want to change the color of a particular component based on personalization, because I find that the developers respond better if the title is blue, but the marketers respond better if the title is red, for example. So if I use parameters in my component, I can do that. If I wasn't using parameters, then again I'd have to create a related links for developers component and a related links for marketers component, which is not very good. It leads to a messy solution and maintenance is a nightmare. Biggest developer tip, okay, use the sublayout parameter helper from the Sitecore marketplace. This is well, it's a module. It's actually a piece of code that John West wrote a little while ago. And if you utilize that bit of code, it's extremely simple. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Then all of these rules will be followed. You'll be using the data source instead of the context item, and properties of your component are set based on parameters set in Sitecore. Okay, let's just understand a bit about the data source. So I mentioned, best practice, don't use the context item, use the data source. So from a development perspective, when I have my custom component, my custom control, that's an ASCX file, it's a web user control. When I place that dynamically on the page, I'm not actually placing my control directly. I'm placing a Sitecore sublayout. Sublayout is a control. It's in the sitecore.web.ui.webcontrols namespace. That control wraps my control. Okay. When the data source is set, it's not actually set on my control directly, because my control just inherits from user control. The data source is actually set on the sub layout. Okay, the information is there. I just need to know how to go and look for it and to use it. So here's some code that developers can use to determine the data source and to use it. Now you notice the very first line of code there. We're using the context item. So we're going to fall back. As I mentioned, the data source may not be set, so we need to pay attention to the data source, but if the data source is not being set, we're going to fall back and use the context item because that could be what we're after. Next line of code, we're checking if the wrapping component around my custom component is a sub-layout. If it is, then we can extract the data source property from it. We'll check to make sure that that data source is not empty, to make sure that it has been configured. Then I can locate that item in the Sitecore database. I can use that as my data source. So when I'm coding in my solution, rather than using sitecore.context.item, I can be using data source item, that variable there. The next tip is to use parameters. So configured parameters are passed as query string in a query string format by Sitecore to your component. So an easy way to utilize this, so if we just quickly skip down to the page load method, they're passed in the SC parameters attribute. So I can extract those, and they're in query string format. To parse out that query string format, I can use the Sitecore web-util parse query string method. Okay, that gives me back a dictionary of parameters. Now, at this point, I could either have some custom code in there to determine what to do, but a much nicer way of doing it and an easy way of doing it is I define a property on my class, as you can see there, the very top one, and then I can use the Sitecore reflection util set property method to set those properties. So I can enumerate the dictionary, I can go through and I can find each particular setting, and then I can apply that to parameters of my class. Okay, so with that knowledge, let's go and fix that component from the earlier demo to make it work. Okay, so if you recall, we had the related links component, and that wasn't, this currently is not personalizable. As you can see here, it's displaying some links in a title, but it's not from the data source. It's probably from the host page. There's probably some fields on there that it's reading. Okay, so in Visual Studio, which is the application most often used by developers when developing with Sitecore, all I need to do is use the sublayout parameter module. So as I mentioned in the slides, the sublayout parameter helper module was developed by John West of Sitecore, and it's, in my opinion, this is the easiest way to make sure that your components are DMS ready. So I'm going to comment out the previous code, and I've got the fix right here. So realistically, all I need to do is inherit from sublayout base. If I do this, I'm going to get a brand new property exposed called data source item, which I can use in place of when I would have previously used Sitecore context item. As you can see here, data source item. Okay, data source item is set based on the configured data source, or if there's no data source, it will fall back to the context item. Okay, and with that change, I also just have to tweak where the title is being pulled from. So previously the title was just static. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm reading that title from the configured data source. Okay, I'll just build that now. So I've built my changes. If I come back over to Sitecore, and I'll just refresh that page. Okay, great. So now I can see that, yes, the component is now paying attention to the data source. Let's just validate that. I'll go and set the associated contents. I'll change the data source. I'm going to change this down to the new links that I created. Okay, so that was the new content that I created when I added this component to the page. And there we see it's updated the presentation. It's updated the title and it's updated the links. Okay, so it was as simple as that. To get to fix the component, all I had to do was subclass from sublayout base, and the component now works. So from a development perspective, it's one line of code that I have to include in each of my components when I'm developing them. Okay, And that, in a nutshell, is how we can determine if we're ready for personalization with DMS and how we can go about assessing our current solution and then fixing some issues that might pop up in that assessment. And with that, I'll pass back to Anaban.
Thank you. Thanks, Alistair. So I'll just talk something about eDynamic. We are a digital consultancy that helps clients globally to acquire and engage customers. Talking about Sitecore, we are Sitecore certified partners since 2004. We have Sitecore clients globally. Our partnership extends to geographies including North America, Middle East, Asia, India. We have delivered numerous Sitecore solutions and have many Sitecore clients globally. As I said, we are a global company and we are founded in 1999. So I'll not go much in details, but we have a few questions coming up, and Alistair, I'll throw some questions at you so that we can take them with the limited time we have. So the first question, I think, it's how are these developed in Sitecore by the back-end developers? So Alistair, if you could answer this.
Yep, sure. So as I mentioned during the presentation, there are two different kinds of components in Sitecore that we're going to be looking at when we're looking at personalization, and that is an XSLT rendering and a sublayout. Now the XSLT rendering, it's written in a language called XSLT. Okay, it transforms the internal data structure from Sitecore that Sitecore provides the component into HTML and puts it on the page. If the developer created the component using a rendering, an XSLT rendering, then it is already personalizable because implicitly that already pays attention to the data source, and that's the biggest hurdle when trying to get personalization to work. If they were using a sublayout, then they can simply follow the steps as I showed in the presentation to make sure that they can read the data from the data source. So the biggest one there is if they use the sublayout parameter helper from the Sitecore marketplace. That's the easiest way to make sure that the component is written in the right way and that the data source is being adhered to.
All right. We have another question. It's how do I apply the profiling for each page?
Okay. So I mentioned in there the profiling. I gave a bit of an explanation around how when you set, as a user navigates the site, how that profile is built up. Now to make that work, we need to apply profiles to each of our pieces of content, each of our pages in the website. Unfortunately, this is a manual operation because realistically each page is going to be different. Now if you have pages within a section that can be very safely assigned to a particular group, so let's say, using the example I gave previously, if we've got a developer persona, a project manager persona and an accountant persona, well, on my website I may have broken it up logically by role. So I may have as a first level navigation page developer tips. It's probably fair to say everything within that developer tips section is for developers. Maybe some are for project managers, but most of them are going to be for developers. So if I can determine that a particular subtree of my content tree is just for one particular component, I can use a scripting module such as PowerShell or Revolver, and I can copy the profile set on one item down to many other items. Okay, so if I can specify criteria by which the page is profiled, perhaps I've got some kind of taxonomy that I've implemented, okay, and in that taxonomy I can say these particular categories in the taxonomy, developers are concerned with those, or the accountants are going to be concerned with those. I may have a finance category in my taxonomy, for example. Then again, if I can quantify it that way, I can use one of the scripting modules to traverse through the content tree and set that particular profile. But at a basic level, yeah, you are required to go through each of the pages and apply that profile. I suppose that's probably another reason that I see DMS not being taken up as quickly as some people would like. You know, a marketer may see a DMS demo and it looks really great, and they see the profiling, that's really great, they understand it, but they just don't fully appreciate how much effort it's going to require to go through every page of the site and assign a profile to it. Okay, if you knew from the get-go that you wanted to implement personalization, it might be a good opportunity at the start of the project to define your personas up front and then go through and apply them.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. There are a few more questions, but I'm afraid we'll have to get back to them after the webinar. At this note, I'd like to end the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our webinar. We hope you found it informative. The recording of this webinar will be available on our website within next 2 to 3 business days. We'll also be sharing the webcast URL with all the attendees via email. Please feel free to reach out to us at contact@edynamic.net for any questions you might have. Thank you once again. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
The